So, today we're going to read Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 of My Teacher is an Alien. We left off last time with Susan passing her friend a note during a test, or attempting to pass a note, right? And Mr. Smith took the note along with her test, and the note did not say nice things about him, so I'm really excited to find out what happens and if he sees the note. So, here we go. Chapter 3, An Unearthly Noise. The only thing I could think about for the rest of the day was how I was going to get that note back. When we went outside for recess, I pulled Stacy aside to tell her what had happened. "What am I going to do now?" I wailed. "I don't know," she said, "but you'd better do something, because if that note has my name on it, Mr. Smith will get mad at me too." "Maybe he won't see it," I said. Stacy snorted. "Are you kidding? He's checked every single paper we have handed in." Stacy was right. She was always right when it came to that kind of stuff. Actually, the heavy-duty checking was probably the best thing about Mr. Smith. He always handed back our papers. Of course, they never had a note or comment on them, just lots of red circles around the mistakes and a grade at the top. I didn't mind that on math papers, but it really annoyed me when it came to my writing. When Miss Schwartz marked our stories and essays, she had always penciled in comments that showed she was paying attention to our ideas. When Mr. Smith handed back an essay, it looked as though he had been sitting next to an ex-murderer while he was marking it. The man must have bought red pens by the case, but all he used them for was to circle missing commas and misspelled words. He treated our essays like spelling tests. I ask you, what's the point of writing something if that's the only response you get? Finally, I decided to try to get back into the building to see if I could snatch my note while Mr. Smith was still outside. If it had been Miss Schwartz, I would have just asked if I could go to the bathroom. But Mr. Smith didn't believe in letting you off the playground for such a frivolous reason. He said by the time you were in 6th grade, you should know enough to take care of things like that in advance. The first 3 days after Mr. Smith came, we had a line of worried-looking kids standing at the door each time recess ended. The second best method for getting off the playground was getting sick. "I'll see you inside," I said to Stacy. Then I clutched my stomach, squinched up my face, and staggered over to where Mr. Smith was standing. Later, I remembered that he was looking straight at the sun. But right then, I was too worried about the note to pay attention to the fact that what he was doing should have burned his eyeballs out. I moaned, trying to sound pitiful. Mr. Smith looked down at me. "Is something wrong, Miss Simmons?" he asked. "I don't feel good," I said. "I want to see the nurse." Mr. Smith hesitated, then looked at his watch. "It's time to go in now anyway," he said. "Line up with the rest of the class. You can see Mrs. Glocka after we get in." Now what? If I claimed I was about to throw up, he'd probably let me go inside right away. But if he was bringing everyone else into the classroom, I wouldn't have any time that I needed to go through the papers and find the note. "All right," I moaned, trying to sound pitiful. I hoped it would make him feel guilty. I almost wished I was going to throw up. I'd make sure to hit his shoes. Of course, once we were inside, I had to go to the nurse's office, even though I actually felt perfectly fine. Mrs. Glocka told me to lie down. I wasn't surprised. That was her basic cure for everything. So I lay there, staring at the ceiling and worrying about the note. Finally, I decided to follow Mr. Smith home. Maybe I could find some way to get the note back before it was too late. I didn't have any big plan, mind you. I was just desperate. I wasn't sure where Mr. Smith lived, but I figured it couldn't be too far since he always walked to school. So after the last bell, I hung around on the playground, waiting for Mr. Smith to come out of the building. I was concentrating so hard I almost jumped out of my skin when Peter Thompson came up behind me and said, "Hey, Susan, what are you doing?" "None of your business," I hissed. "Leave me alone." Peter's skinny face kind of crumbled, and he looked like he was going to cry. "Look," I said, "this is private, okay?" "Sure," said Peter. "I won't bother you." He tucked his book under his arm and walked away, trying to whistle. It was a pretty pathetic sound. I thought about Peter and realized with a shock that I probably was the closest thing he had to a friend. That made me kind of sad. Not that there's anything wrong with having me for a friend, but because I have a lot of friends, and I didn't really think of Peter as being one of them. I liked him all right. He just wasn't someone I spent much time with. I wondered if there was anyone who did spend time with him. My thoughts were interrupted when I saw Mr. Smith come out of the building. I waited for a minute or two, then began sneaking along behind him. I tried to stay half a block or so away. Whenever I could, I ducked behind a tree or a bush so he wouldn't spot me. I probably looked pretty weird, but that's one nice thing about being a kid. You can get away with this kind of stuff. Mr. Smith's home was farther away than I had expected. He lived on the edge of town in an old white house with black shutters. The house was set back from the street. A thick hedge completely surrounded the lot on which it stood. I stood outside of the hedge feeling stupid. What had I hoped to accomplish by following Mr. Smith? But I was in luck. As I watched from a hole in the hedge, Mr. Smith set his briefcase down on the porch and went inside. Since it was a warm afternoon, I figured he'd planned to get something to drink, then come back out to sit on the porch and correct papers. This was my chance. I scooted through a hole in the hedge and onto the porch. I was working up the nerve to go open the briefcase when I heard an unearthly howl. It sounded like someone was trying to put a cat in a blender. Hot as it was, I felt my blood turn to ice. What was going on in there? Had someone attacked Mr. Smith? I wasn't crazy about the man, but I didn't want him to be tortured or anything, which is what that sounded like. Should I run for help? Should I go inside? But what help could I be anyway? What help could I find? All I could say was that I heard a terrible noise. Nobody was yelling for help or anything like that. I didn't think I could get anyone to come. Then it occurred to me that maybe Mr. Smith really was putting a cat in a blender, or something awful like that. If so, he certainly shouldn't be teaching our class. I decided to find out. Whew, I don't know what Susan is going to find if she goes up close to that house. Maybe he is putting a cat into a blender. Chapter 4. Broxholm. The door was unlocked. Trying not to make any noise, I turned the knob and pushed. The door opened without a sound. I hesitated for just a moment, then stepped in. I was standing in a hallway. To my left, I saw an empty living room. And I do mean empty. Except for curtains, there wasn't one bit of furniture or decoration in the room. The walls and floor were totally bare. I flinched as another burst of horrible squawking and growling sounded above me. Taking a deep breath, I began to tiptoe up the stairs. I was glad I was wearing sneakers. About halfway up, I stopped and thought, what am I doing? I should get out of here while I can. You may not believe this, but the only reason I didn't turn back was that I thought Mr. Smith might really be in trouble. Even though I didn't like the man, I didn't want anything horrible to happen to him. So I swallowed and took another step. The noise stopped. Was everything over? Would Mr. Smith start down the stairs and find me standing here? I was just about to turn and run when another round of squawking and shrieking made it clear that whatever was happening was still going on. I still wanted to run, but I was afraid to. Afraid that if I did, I might read in the paper the next day that something terrible happened to Mr. Smith, something I could have prevented. Of course, I was afraid to keep going, but I decided I didn't have any choice. I took another step, and then another. I held onto the railing as if it was a lifeline. The knot in my stomach got tighter with every step I took. When I got near the top, I lay down on my stomach. I read somewhere that when you're peering around a corner, you're less likely to be seen if your head is low. So I kept my head as low as possible. If I could have pulled out one eye and just stuck it around the corner to take a peek, that would have been fine with me. The hall was as empty as the living room. No pictures on the wall, no rug on the floor. Through an open door at the end of the hall, I could see a small blue bathroom. Closer to me, on the right, was another open door. The horrible sound seemed to be coming from there. I decided low was the way to go. Still on my belly, I slithered down one side of the hall until I reached the doorway. I shivered. That noise was like a tiger running its claws down a blackboard. It felt like aluminum foil against my teeth. What could be making it? When I finally got up the nerve to sneak a look around the bottom edge of the door, I saw Mr. Smith sitting at a little makeup table, looking in a mirror. Stacy was right. The man really was handsome. He had a long, lean face with a square jaw, a straight nose, and cheekbones to die for. Only it was fake. As I watched, Mr. Smith pressed his fingers against the bottoms of his eyes. Suddenly, he ran his fingertips to the side of his head, grabbed his ears, and started peeling off his face. I gasped. Fortunately, the horrible noises coming up from the room drowned it out. I wanted to get up and run, but I was too terrified to move. I started to shake instead. Whatever Mr. Smith was, I was pretty sure the face he was slowly uncovering wasn't anything that had been born on Earth. As he stripped away the mask, I could see that he had skin the color of limes. His enormous orange eyes slanted up and away from his nose like a pair of butterfly wings. A series of muscular-looking ridges stretched from his eyes down to his lipless mouth. Soon, the handsome face of Mr. Smith was lying on the dressing table. The creature that had been hidden underneath it began to massage his face, his real face. "Ah," he said, "what a relief." He smiled at himself in the mirror, showing 2 rows of rounded, purplish teeth. I had noticed that the horrible noise was coming from a pair of flat pieces of plastic hanging on the wall. But it wasn't until Mr. Smith started singing along with the sound that I realized the plastic sheets were speakers. The hideous sound was music, or at least what passed for music wherever my alien teacher had come from. I was still trying to find the courage to start backing up when the alien turned down the music and flipped the switch on the table. The mirror began to shimmer. Suddenly, the image of Mr. Smith was replaced by another alien face, this one just as horrible. Beyond the face, I could see a big room with other aliens bustling about. From the look of things, I figured this must be a spaceship. The face in the mirror said something that sounded like "ing-ring-ing-ring." The words were low and growly. "Broxham reporting," said Mr. Smith. The face in the mirror made some growly noises. "It is good to hear from our mother tongue," said Mr. Smith, or Broxham, or whatever his name was. "I cannot wait to return to the ship and have this language implant removed, so I can speak the true tongue, and not this barbaric garble." Hey, I thought, whose language are you calling barbaric? But before I could get too angry, I heard something else, something that sent a cold chill down my spine. "The testing process is proceeding on schedule," said Broxham. "Before long, I will have selected the students I wish to bring back for study." Bring back for study? I couldn't believe my ears. My teacher was an alien. Even worse, he had come to Earth to kidnap kids and take them into space. That's the end of Chapter 4. I hope that you enjoyed reading with me today. I know that I'm on the edge of my seat. I can't believe that Susan's teacher is an alien and he's planning to take home some of those students to study them. Wow. All right. Come read with me again tomorrow. Bye-bye.